Good day, third year students. I am Denver Dale Bibautis, one of the teaching assistants of Dr. Alice Ramos, and I am here to discuss with you one of the literary lenses, which is the New Criticism lens. New criticism is a movement in 20th century literary criticism that arose in reaction to those traditional extrinsic approaches that saw a text as making a moral or philosophical statement or as an outcome of social, economic, political, historical, or biographical phenomena. New criticism holds that a text must be evaluated apart from its context. Failure to do so causes the affective fallacy, which confuses a text with the emotional or psychological response of its readers, or the intentional fallacy, which conflates textual impact and the objectives of the author. New criticism assumes that a text is an isolated entity that can be understood through the tools and techniques of close reading, maintains that each text has unique texture, and asserts that what a text says and how it says it are inseparable. The task of the new critic is to show the way a reader can take the myriad and apparently discordant elements of a text and reconcile or resolve them into a harmonious thematic whole. In summary, the objective is to unify this text, or rather to recognize the inherent but obscure unity therein. The reader's awareness of and attention to elements of the form of the work mean that a text eventually will yield to the analytical scrutiny and interpretive pressure that close reading provides. To simply put, close reading is the hallmark of new criticism. The genesis of new criticism can be found in the early years of the 20th century in the work of the British philosopher I.A. Richards and his student William Epson. Another important figure in the beginnings of new criticism was the American writer and critic T.S. Eliot. Later practitioners and proponents include John Crow Ransom, Clint Brooks, Alan Tate, Robert Penn Warren, Rennie Welleck, and William Wimsatt. In many ways, new criticism runs in temporal parallel to the American modern period. From the 1930s to the 1960s in the United States, new criticism was the accepted approach to literary study and criticism in scholarly journals and in college and university English departments. Among the lasting legacies of new criticism is the conviction that surface reading of literature is insufficient. A critic, to arrive at and make sense of the latent potency of a text, must explore very carefully its inner sanctum by noting the presence and the patterns of literary devices within the text. Only this new criticism asserts, and it enables one to decode completely a story. New criticism gave discipline and depth to literary scholarships through emphasis on the text and the close reading thereof. However, the analytic and interpretive moves made in the practice of new criticism tend to be most effective in lyric and complex intellectual poetry. The inability to deal adequately with other kinds of text proved to be a significant liability in this approach. Furthermore, the exclusion of writer, reader, and context from scholarly inquiry has made new criticism vulnerable to serious objections. Despite its radical origins, new criticism was fundamentally a conservative enterprise. By the 1960s, its dominance began to erode, and eventually it ceded primacy to critical approaches that demanded examination of the realities of production and reception. Today, although new criticism has few champions, in many respects it remains an approach to literature from which other critical modes depart or against which they militate. So, for you to be able to understand what new criticism lens can do, I have here a video presentation of an English American literature titled The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. What you need to do is to watch and jot down the important scenes in the story or how the story went by. Afterwards, we will be going to discuss it one by one.
The story begins with a piece of news, a tragic one, the supposed death of Mr. Mallard. Mr. Mallard's friend, Richards, and Mrs. Mallard's sister, Josephine, are extremely worried as they contemplate on communicating the supposed death of Mr. Mallard to his wife. Mrs. Mallard has a heart condition, and any piece of news that can trigger intense emotions can be lethal for her. Richards gets to know of a railroad disaster and finds Brentley Mallard's name on the list of the deceased victims. Through a second telegram, the news is confirmed. He tells Josephine, who communicates it to Louise in broken sentences and veiled hints. She tries to make the blow as soft as possible. Louise weeps in wild abandonment. After a while, she calms down and goes away into her room, forbidding anyone from following her. She sinks into a chair, facing the window. She feels something coming to her, and at first she fears this sensation. Soon, the sensation renders her powerless. Free, free, free. Her eyes light up and her pulse starts to pick up pace, and soon her worn-out body starts to relax. She loved her husband very much, and so did he love her. Even so, she isn't able to shake off the exalted anticipation for the days that are yet to come. Free, body and soul free. Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. Go away. I'm not making myself ill. With a feverish triumph, she opens the door and clasps her sister's waist and heads downstairs, where Richards is waiting for them. That is when the unexpected happens. They all are startled by the sound of the latchkey turning and the door opening. Brentley Mallard, travel-strained but very much alive, enters the house with his gripsack and umbrella. Josephine lets out a shriek, and Richard moves to screen him from Louise's view. But they are too late. Louise sees her husband, and the sudden, intense emotion that she experienced of the latchkey turning and the door opening. Brentley Mallard, travel-strained but very much alive, enters the house with his gripsack and umbrella. Josephine lets out a shriek, and Richard moves to screen him from Louise's view. But they are too late. Louise sees her husband, and the sudden, intense emotion that she experiences consumes her. The story ends with the doctor's verdict. Louise died of joy.
Alright, it seems like that you have all watched the video. Let me summarize it for you. Louise Maillard has heart trouble, so she must be informed carefully about her husband's death. Her sister Josephine tell her the news. Louise's husband's friend Richards learned about a railroad disaster when he was in the newspaper office and saw Louise's husband Brentley on the list of those killed. Louise begins sobbing when Josephine tells her of Brentley's death and goes upstairs to be alone in her room. Louise sits down and looks out an open window. She sees trees, smells approaching rain, and hears a peddler yelling out what he's selling. She hears someone singing as well as the sounds of sparrows, and there are floppy white clouds in the sky. She is young, with lines around her eyes. Still crying, she gazes into the distance. She feels apprehensive and tries to suppress the building emotions within her, but can't. She begins repeating the word free to herself over and over again. Her heart beats quickly and she feels very warm. Louise knows she'll cry again when she sees Brentley's corpse. His hands were tender, and he always looked at her lovingly. But then she imagines the years ahead, which belong only to her now, and spreads her arms out joyfully with anticipation. She will be free, on her own without anyone to oppress her. She thinks that all women and men oppress one another even if they do it out of kindness. Louise knows that she often felt love for Brentley but tells herself that none of that matters anymore. She feels ecstatic with her newfound sense of independence. Josephine comes to her door, begging Louise to come out, warning her that she'll get sick if she doesn't. Louise tells her to go away. She fantasizes about all days and years ahead and hopes that she lives a long life. Then she opens the door, and she and Josephine start walking down the stairs where Richard is waiting. The front door unexpectedly opens, and Bradley comes in. He hadn't been in the train accident or even aware that one had happened. Josephine screams and Richards try unsuccessfully to block Louise from seeing him. Doctors arrive and pronounce that Louise died of a heart attack brought on by happiness. Now, we will be applying one of the critical lenses, which is the new criticism lens, into our chosen story, which is the story of an or. Basically, its definition is reading a text for the unity and complexity of its form. The focus should be on the text itself. There are questions and strategies for you to be able to really understand how to apply this type of lens in any literary piece. Number one, what types of symbolism are in the text? Two, what themes recur throughout the text? Three, were the plot and subplots believable? Four, where could the story go from here? Five, what did you think of the ending? Six, what is the great strength or most noticeable weakness of the text? And last but not the least, does the story fit an archetype? For example, romance, tragedy, comedy, satire, or irony. How do those types manifest themselves? So these are just an examples or questions or strategies that you can use to apply new criticism lens in any literary piece. For number one question, what types of symbolism are in the text? So there are two symbolism that has been mentioned in the text. So first is the heart trouble. The heart trouble that afflicts Louise is both a physical and symbolic malady that represent her ambivalence toward her marriage and unhappiness with her lack of freedom. The fact that Louise has heart trouble is the first thing we learn about her. And this heart trouble is what seems to make the announcement of Brentley's death so threatening. A person with a weak heart, after all, would not deal well with such news. When Louise reflects on her new independence, her heart races, pumping blood through her veins. When she dies at the end of the story, the diagnosis of heart disease seems appropriate because the shock of seeing Brentley was surely enough to kill her. But the doctor's conclusion that she died of overwhelming joy is ironic because it had been the loss of joy that had actually killed her. Indeed, Louise seems to have died of a broken heart caused by the sudden loss of her much loved independence. So, number two symbolism that has been mentioned in the text is the open window. The open window from which Louise gazes for much of the story represents the freedom and opportunities that await her after her husband has died. From the window, Louise sees blue sky, fluffy clouds, In treetops, she hears people and birds singing and smells a calming rainstorm. Everything that she experienced through her senses suggests joy and spring, new life. And when she ponders the sky, she feels the first hints of elation. Once she fully indulges in this excitement, she feels that the open window is providing her with life itself. The open window provides a clear, bright view into the distance and Louis' own bright future, which is now unobstructed by the demands of another person. It's therefore no coincidence that when Louise turns from the window in the view, she quickly loses her freedom as well. For number two question, what themes recur throughout the text? So there are two themes that has been viewed in this story. One is the forbidden joy of independence. In the story of an R, independence is a forbidden pleasure that can be imagined only privately. When Louise hears from Josephine and Richards of Brentley's death, she reacts with obvious grief, and although her reaction is perhaps more violent than other women's, it is an appropriate one. Alone, however, Louise begins to realize that she is now an independent woman, a realization that enlivens and excites her. Even though these are her private thoughts, she at first tries to squelch the joy she feels, to beat it back with her will. Such resistance reveals how forbidden this pleasure really is. When she finally does acknowledge the joy, she feels possessed by it and must abandon herself to it, as the world free escapes her lips. Louis' life offers no refuge for this kind of joy, and the rest of society will never accept it or understand it. Extreme circumstances have given Louise a taste of this forbidden fruit, and her thoughts are, in turn, extreme. She sees her life as being absolutely hers and her new independence as the core of her being. Overwhelmed, Louise even turns to prayer, hoping for a long life in which to enjoy this feeling. When Brantley returns, he unwittingly yanks Louise's independence away from her, putting it once again out of her reach. The forbidden joy disappears as quickly as it came, but the taste of it is enough to kill her. Number two is the inherent oppressiveness of marriage. Chopin suggested that all marriages, even the kindest ones, are inherently oppressive. Louise, who readily admits that her husband was kind and loving, nonetheless feels joy when she believes that he has died. Her reaction doesn't suggest any malice, and Louise knows that she'll cry at Brentley's funeral. However, despite the love between husband and wife, Louise views Brentley's death as a release from oppression. She never names a specific way in which Brentley oppressed her, hinting instead that marriage in general stifles both women and men. She even seems to suggest that she oppressed Brentley just as much as he oppressed her. Louise' epiphany in which these thoughts parade through her mind reveals the inherent oppressiveness of all, which by nature rob people of their independence. For number three question, were the plot and subplots believable? When I initially read this story, the conclusion astonished me, and I was disappointed in how she perceived marriage. I therefore found it unimaginable that anyone could have such a poor outlook on love and marriage. This time around, as I read the story once again, I noticed a lot more uplifting aspect to it. I think I now have a slightly clearer perspective on it as well. This story has numerous indications of life. which point to this young woman's rebirth. She used metaphors like fresh spring life, breath of rain, and numerous birds were twittering in the eaves to describe the possibilities for life or her life after her husband's death. But before his death, she dreaded each day and was pressed down by a physical exhaustion that tormented her body. I believe it's crucial where she decides to handle this change. She is sitting in a cozy armchair in her bedroom, which suggests she felt secure there. Her husband's passing seemed to be the answer to life for her. This time, the conclusion is more ironic than shocking. She passed away because she had the capacity to be unhappy about her husband. For number four question, where could the story go from here? From the moment Louise Maillard learns of her husband's death to the moment he suddenly returns alive, the story only spans 1 hour in her life. The structure's condensed length and intensity reflect the intense hour Louise spends considering her newfound independence. We are engrossed along with Louise in this little instant, just as she is totally lost in her irrational thoughts at the time. Although this narrative can be read fast, it has a significant impact. Louisa's joyous response when she first murmurs free to herself is what first surprises us. When she passes away just as Brentley is about to leave, she surprises us once more. The heart disease mentioned at the end of this story echoes the heart trouble discussed at the beginning, intensifying the twist ending and bringing the story to a satisfying close. For number five question, what did you think of the ending? The story of An R has a classic fake out finale. The death of Mr. Maillard, which begins the narrative, is fully undone in the conclusion. He begins out dying and ends up surviving. Therefore, it's not a linear life story. At the end, Mrs. Maillard's life is lost despite the efforts of her friends and family to save it at the beginning. As a result, the character avoided incident that the story was trying to avoid occurs at the conclusion. It's ironic that, upon further inspection, quite harsh, consider the final sentence once more. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease of joy that kills. One thing the readers can be confident of from this is that Mrs. Maillard has passed away. The doctor cited that Mrs. Maillard's pleasure at learning her husband wasn't dead is what caused it. If only it happened, it would be horrible turn of events. She was murdered by her joy. That would demonstrate how deeply she cared for her spouse. For number six question, what is the great strength or most noticeable weakness of the text? I believe the plot's strength comes from Mrs. Maillard's struggles with her loss and the introduction of new information and skills. Despite her efforts, she is unable to totally push it away. She finally gives in to the knowledge that she is free and that she is happy. Mrs. Maillard is so overcome by her sense of freedom that she can hardly whisper after the tragedy of receiving such dreadful news and coping with such shifting emotions of grief and abandonment. Also, when Mrs. Maillard leaves her room, feeling triumphant after overcoming her sadness, her lack of sadness, and her newly discovered longing for freedom. She exits her room like a brand new person, stronger for her loss and enthusiastic about her future. She feels so much emotion and adrenaline that it's almost like she's getting high and she can't stop thinking about how she's finally free. I think the weakness of this story would be its conclusion. When, according to the doctors, Mrs. Maillard passed away from joy. Based on what we know about Mrs. Maillard, her weak heart, her shock upon seeing Mr. Maillard, and the narrator's comment that Richards couldn't prevent her new shock. We readers must put together the fact that Mrs. Maillard has passed away. We conclude that Mrs. Maillard has passed away based on the information and the medical professional's diagnosis of her demise. In contrast to her husband's passing the train tragedy, there was no opportunity for error or misunderstanding. She can't go back. The initial situations, predictions of future events have come to pass. And for our last question, does the story fit an archetype or, for example, romance, tragedy, comedy, satire, or irony? And how do those types manifest themselves? Chopin manages to make every praise significant by using an almost lyrical writing style because such a little story provides no room for background information, flashbacks, or needless guesswork when she repeatedly employs the term open throughout the novel to underline the freedom of Louis' new life. She is highlighting an essential point. One of the few praises Louis actually says out loud in this story, free, which conveys how much she values her newfound freedom, is also repeated by Louis repeatedly. Chopin emphasizes key points by repeating phrases and sentence structures in addition to words. Chopin, for instance, penned the following. She breathed a quick prayer that life might belong. The exact wording of the second half of each line highlights how drastically Louis' life has changed. She used to cringe at the notion of a long life, but now she prays for it. It was only yesterday that she had thought with a horror that life might belong. Finally, Chopin employs internal rhymes and alliteration to beautify the story's text. For instance, when Josephine gives Louis the news, she exposes in half concealing, and Bentley afterwards arrive composedly carrying his possessions. Chopin uses a variety of stylistic and structural devices to create a really compelling short story. I believe you are possible to interpret or discover what are the factors to be taken into account in evaluating a certain piece by responding to the questions to critic a literary piece through new criticism lens. The new criticism has a somewhat formalist vibe about it, a detailed reading of the rhythm, meter, topic, imagery, metaphor, and so on. It is a key component of the new criticism methodology. The new critics also believed that a work's quality and its meaning should be inherent and not have to be understood in relation to the reaction of its viewers. Because poetry, in their opinion, is the purest exemplification of the literary ideals they championed. The new critics preferred poetry over other literary forms. However, plays, novels, and other literary forms are also subject to close reading and structural analysis tools. In other words, the idea of art for art's sake is promoted by new criticism movement which focuses on the text itself or what we call close reading and purposely ignores the author, the reader, and the social environment itself. And that's it for our today's discussion. I hope you have learned so much from one of the critical lenses in the literary criticism, which is the new criticism lens. Thank you so much, third year students.